was a golden age of filmmaking because we were all single, ambitious, and we were in love with film.
We felt that we were going to take over the world, that we were going to make real change, and that things were going to be different.
This was the time to make it. This was going to be it. So there was a great deal of urgency about that. We did everything and anything.
I'm trying you.
I ended up at USC Film School. I didn't know anything about it. I thought this might be interesting. I got in there, and within a month, I had discovered something that I loved, something that I was very good at. I was learning the techniques of filmmaking, and I learned them very fast in a period of 18 months. I learned about animation, about screenwriting, about directing, about camera, about editing, a whole range of techniques, and I learned it very fast. And I think that was a real advantage because when I got into the film business, I could get jobs as a cameraman, I could get jobs as an editor, I could work as a writer, and eventually I became a director.
The only thing we could do was try to express ourselves on film the way the people around us were doing that. And that we had hoped, of course, that would lead to making films in narrative cinema in America.
Well, at the time, all these directors emerged, there was actually no way they were going to be employed by Hollywood. Hollywood was very much a closed industry in those days. And the way into theatrical filmmaking was via Roger Corman. And Coppola was the first one, obviously, to work for him, later Scorsese. Corman provided the model for the sort of independence they wanted.
Francis Ford Coppola is the writer-director on the crest of the new wave of American filmmakers. Already he has been named Best Director, and the Rain People awarded the grand prize at the San Sebastian Festival in Spain.
He'd gotten on the wall somehow, and he'd gotten, the local authorities convinced that he should be there. And of course, he brought in the Trojan horse.
Would you tell something about your young assistant, George Lucas?
Associate.
Associate, okay.
George won an award to come to Warner Brothers and observe a film being made there, and he came when we were making Phineas Rainbow, and one day I was working on a show, and I kept seeing a skinny kid with a beard, and he was always looking. I went up to him, I said, well, I said, who's that? And he said, well, he's observing you.
I think the student films are the only real hope. I think they're slowly beginning to realize that students know what they're doing.
There was an issue of Time magazine, and it had pictures of all of us in there, and we just won the National Student Film Festival.
As the oldest of the film school grads, Francis Coppola set up Zoetrope as a production banner for emerging talent.
Two of the new generation of film men, Francis Coppola and George Lucas, are discussing director Lucas' new movie, THX 1138.
George, where did the very first idea of Thex come to you?
It actually came from reading comic books when I was about 10 years old.
Well, Zoetrope was the first attempt by a kind of outsider filmmaker who was going to bring together and form a commune of filmmakers. And it's to Francis's credit that he tried to put it together.
Everybody had like a 6-picture deal with Francis. So it was about 6 other filmmakers, my husband among them, whose projects were supposed to go at Warner's.
The deal was we were driving to Warner Brothers. Francis would show them THX, which was American Zoetrope's flagship first production. And then they would be presented with these silver boxes with our scripts.
They saw THX, everyone's project was canceled.
Lucas was angry and humiliated by Warner Brothers' reaction to the film and the studio's cancellation of the other Zoetrope projects. A crushed Francis Coppola withdrew to San Francisco, taking a high-paying script job on the film Patton.
In the 30s, 40s, and 50s, Paramount was one of the great legendary studios, great stars. But by the time you get to the 1960s, it really was the bottom of the top 8.
Would you believe that Paramount was bought, 5 years before The Godfather was made? The entire studio was bought for $600,000.
Charlie Bluhdorn was the head of Gulf Western, which was a giant conglomerate who had bought Paramount. He was a very dynamic entrepreneur, buying and selling companies and countries and God knows what all.
The Mel Brooks film, Silent Movie, was all about what was going on in Hollywood at the time. because it's about an old-time Hollywood studio that was bought out by a conglomerate called Engulf and Devour, which is clearly a reference to Gulf and Western. Engulf and Devour were these scary guys in a boardroom in New York City who were heartless and not interested in any kind of creativity and not really even interested in movies. In fact, they were thinking of just selling off the real estate just to turn a profit.
Charlie told me they're going to close the studio down. I said, give me a chance to go and make a presentation to the board.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Evans, and I'm Senior Vice President of Paramount Pictures. My job at Paramount is to oversee our productions around the world. These past few years have been rough for Hollywood. We've made a lot of mistakes. But I want to bring up one project, and that's The Godfather. To bring up the similarity between The Godfather and Love Story, which are the two biggest books of the last decade. We developed both of these books, spurring the writers on to make these books what we think will be the great movies they're going to be.
With their minuscule budget in safe hands, Paramount and Ruddy then approached a young director. Francis Ford Coppola had all the qualities they were looking for.
There was one important reason why he should do the picture, namely, he was broke.
Frankly, I believe they hired him because he was cheap.
He was born to do the movie. There's nobody else who could have done that movie.
In 1970, Paramount announced that Puzo's The Godfather was finally to be made into a movie. They had no idea how traumatic the next 2 years would be. News of the film would enrage a powerful civil rights organization run by a real-life mafia godfather. He would vow to stop the film by any means necessary.
He wanted to stop it. There was no way of shooting. They wouldn't get any cooperation.
Hollywood and the mafia would do battle on the streets of New York.
The idea that Francis would cast somebody small and dark and very Italian-looking, in fact, an Italian, seemed to the studio to be completely mysterious.
Paramount wanted to save money, and so one of the things they wanted to do was to not film it as a period piece in 1946, but instead to bring it up to the 1970s, make it contemporary, because that would be cheaper to, shoot in the contemporary style. Also, they wanted not to shoot in New York. They wanted to shoot it in St. Louis because it would be cheaper. Again,
Francis ran headlong into that maelstrom, which was quite a bit worse than any of us could have imagined. It was just simply a conflict between them wanting to do a kind of low-budget pop boiler, get it out, cash in on the popularity of the book, and Francis wanting to make something meaningful about Italian-Americans and the mafia and, family.
He had a kind of Jedi mind trick, I think, to convince the studio that what they absolutely did not want was, in fact, the best idea. And they went along with all of these, and eventually Francis was shooting The Godfather.
The powers that be at the studio, as they were seeing the dailies, were horrified. Not only, they were horrified with everything. They didn't like Brando. They thought he mumbled. They thought it was much too dark. I wasn't moving the camera.
Francis had to fight every day to get his vision on the screen. It didn't come easy.
But the making of this gangster classic was more dramatic and brutal than the movie itself, sparking real-life mob violence across America. Bombarded by mass protests and a bitter campaign of intimidation, The Godfather was almost never made.
Bob Evans, the head of production for Paramount, was threatened, as was his wife, Ali MacGraw.
When we kill a snake, we chop its head off first. Those threats were real.
Even worse, a genuine mafia godfather vowed to stop the movie by any means necessary.
If he wanted to stop it, there was no way of shooting. I told Al it's a fucking disaster.
Left with no choice, Hollywood struck a historic deal with the mob. But as filming commenced, the streets of New York exploded into a fully fledged mafia war.
We were shooting a movie, and they were shooting it out on the streets of New York.
This is the untold story of The Godfather and the mob. Without the mob being involved in making The Godfather, there'd be no Godfather.
In 1972, Francis Ford Coppola's mafia epic, The Godfather, was released. It broke box office records, won huge critical acclaim, and helped revive the ailing Hollywood studio system.
The Godfather's become part of the popular culture now. It was more than just a movie.
It changed the way pictures looked. It changed the way pictures were cast. It was a seminal moment.
To this day, I don't know that anybody else has ever achieved it.
The Godfather launched the career of director Francis Ford Coppola and relaunched the flagging career of screen icon Marlon Brando, starring as the aging, brooding mafia don. When the movie came out, the FBI immediately began to notice in its surveillance of real mob figures that the movie was having an influence on the way the real mob act. They started kissing hands, kissing rings, calling each other Godfather, treating themselves in a more genteel way. The Godfather, a film initially opposed by the Mafia, was now adopted by the Mafia. It was the ultimate irony. The Mafia believed that The Godfather legitimized them. It was a legacy Coppola had never intended.
Francis was very offended by the fact that the Mafia people took it as a tribute to them.
These days, the term blockbuster is so common in the film industry that it has taken on a meaning of its own. But how did the blockbuster reach such an honoured place in Hollywood culture? Well, to answer that question, here's the history and evolution of the summer blockbuster. 1975. When the film Jaws was first released, word of mouth spread so quickly that people were incredibly eager and crowds would line up for hours before showings. Lines would often wrap around the entire block. As a result, the term blockbuster was coined to refer to a movie that inspired such avid devotion that traffic around the block where the theatre was located was effectively busted.
On one of Hollywood's first all-out marketing blitzes of primetime ads, late-night interviews, and test screenings, Jaws rode a wave of positive buzz to a $470 million worldwide gross. And that's in 1975 money, people. The previous summer, Herbie Rides Again, the sequel to the Magic Love Bug movie, won the summer with only $69 million. Clearly, Jaws marked a sea change in entertainment.
That you are going to ignore this particular problem until it swims up and bites you on the ass!
1977. Studios didn't fully commit to dreaming up big-budget pictures designed to dominate the summer until George Lucas released Star Wars. Star Wars allowed for new film technology to take center stage. When the sequels to Star Wars opened at 3- and 6-year intervals, the Hollywood movie franchise was born.
The blockbuster era began, and this formula for high-concept fun, supported by big campaigns centered in the summer when everyone wants to escape the heat, was codified 2 years later by Spielberg's old pal, George Lucas, for 1977's Star Wars.
I felt a great disturbance in the Force.
A New Hope changed the blockbuster game with a $503 million gross. Movies would now be measured to bars set by Lucas and Spielberg, including the Star Wars sequel, 1980's The Empire Strikes Back. Grossing $400 million worldwide, Empire proved Star Wars' franchise potential and that Lucas had blockbuster gold on the brain.
The movie is pure escapism, no big social message. But these days, with the way the world is, there's a lot to escape from. So it's a good bet that many Americans this spring will be going to that galaxy long ago and far, far away.
Steven Spielberg's shark film was about to change Hollywood's perception of what success really meant.
Lou Wasserman, Sid Sheinberg, Henry H. Hyatt Martin, and Charlie Powell, who were Martin was head of distribution, Powell was head of marketing and publicity, met in the men's room of the theater because it was the only place where they could talk. And Wasserman said, put it out in 12, as many screens as we can get. And they went for 1,200 screens, which was at that time unheard of.
This was a big decision to try to take Jaws and put it out there like they used to do with exploitation pictures. Well, exploitation pictures were meant to come in, make a lot of money before anybody noticed how bad they were, and get out.
When I saw Jaws, I thought, uh-oh, these guys understand what I and my contemporaries are doing, And they have the money and the talent and skill to do them bigger and better.
By the winter of 75-76, Universal's Jaws had rolled up $100 million at the box office. It was the first motion picture in history to do so. Everyone knew everything had changed. Taxi Driver opened later that year to ecstatic reviews and decent business, but decent business wasn't enough anymore. The age of the blockbuster had arrived, and as the grosses climbed, the pressures mounted, and so did the casualties.
Well, I had started using cocaine and amphetamines way before the success, and in fact had had quite a bit of success, you know, working behind it. And in fact, I was thinking yesterday, you know, things I might say about it, and there was a definite progression that went from using it as a tool to using it as a crutch, and then it became, you weren't using it for anything except that it was life itself.
We went to an AFI tribute for Alfred Hitchcock one year during this period. And I went to the men's room, and I swear to God, under every single stall, there was at least 6 or 8 legs. The sound of snorting was so loud that it was just like a joke. And there was this one kind of old attendant, back washroom attendant, sitting there trying to hand out towels. And it was comical. Here's old Alfred Hitchcock up there getting his Life Achievement Award, and all the Hollywood Teufel were in there snorting cocaine. It was crazy.
As drugs overran the Hollywood social scene, the movies themselves began to be affected.
This was the beginning of also the craziness for everyone.
Drugs and excess may have derailed some of Hollywood's new generation, but it was nothing compared to the growing success of the easily promotable B-movies that audiences were embracing. But this was a new kind of B-movie. Instead of a low-budget programmer to fit the bottom of Double Bill, these films were expensive, special effects-driven pictures like Close Encounters that could endanger a studio if they failed. Over in England and in computer labs in California, George Lucas was quietly laboring on the ultimate B-movie.
So George got, from American Graffiti, he got to make a $13 million movie, which was a huge budget in those days. It was a giant. And I remember he called and he said, you know, I don't know if it's going to work at Fox. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, they're not going to give me the rights to any sequels. And he held firm. And he ended up owning the rights to Star Wars. And
he said, I'm gonna make more money by making science fiction toys. I'm gonna make more money than even The Godfather by making science fiction toys. And he hated directing, George did, because he got sick all the time. He had diabetes, and he just wasn't very sturdy.
At the first rough-cut screening of Star Wars, the directorial division of opinion would foretell the future of movies.
George called his friends and said, I want everybody to see a rough cut of Star Wars. And it was hard to watch because it was, the special effects, nothing was there yet. And Brian De Palma was particularly sarcastic and, what's this crap about the Force, what is the Force of others, but George listened and he took it sort of good-naturedly, and the only one who was really optimistic was Spielberg. He said, I think it's great. It's going to make $100 million, and we thought, well, Steve's just Steve, sort of energetic kid. Once he started screening it again, it was like American Graffiti, the audiences just went nuts.
Hollywood, California, August 1977. A triumphant moment in screen history. To the world-famous Chinese theater come the stars of the biggest box office success in motion picture history.
The financial success of Star Wars would, with The Exorcist, Jaws, and Close Encounters, essentially end the epoch of the director-driven film and begin the era of the big-budget B-movie, where the studios could open a film everywhere with nationwide ad campaigns and fast playoffs. It almost didn't matter if the film was good or not, just as long as it made a great trailer. Star Wars was the ultimate triumph of the B-movie. It had taken little more than a decade for the studios to regain their dominance and find their new audience with slick, effects-driven sci-fi horror films, ironic superheroes, and sequels. Endless sequels.
The era of the director, brief era of the director, came to a conclusion in really certainly by the end of the 70s, if not sooner. It was sort of petering out.
They started figuring out the mechanism of what was making money, and so that they wouldn't be in this horrible position of having filmmakers walk in the door and say, you don't know what makes money, I do, I'll make the movie. So finally, after about 10 years, they were able to say, yes, we do know what makes money, and you will make it for us.
I mean, the system allowed these artists to create. And then after a while, when it became essentially conglomerates took over the studios, everything changed.
I think the thing that killed, for me, movies more than anything was the event of Entertainment Tonight, when they started doing box office scores, like football scores. And I remember seeing it the first weekend that they did it, or the first Monday, that this film had come in first and this second, and I looked at that screen and I said, we're over.
Gone are the days when the only way to experience film was buying a ticket at your local theater. Instead, you can watch almost anything you want, whenever you want, wherever you want. Film studios have made a lot of their back catalogs available to the public with things like DVDs and Blu-ray or online streaming services. And you can screen movies on TVs, computers, tablets, phones, and even some watches if you squint really hard. Home video transformed the film industry and the ways we find and consume motion pictures. Now, what really brought home movies into the mainstream was the advent of home video technology. And Betamax, or Beta for short, was one of the world's first. Invented in Japan and introduced to the United States in 1975, Beta could record audio and video signals to a magnetic tape, much like the ones in audio cassettes. Now, Beta's main competition was another Japanese technology called the Video Home System, or VHS. It was essentially the same idea as Beta, except it was lighter, cheaper, and one cassette could hold a 2-hour movie. So in the ensuing video format wars, Beta couldn't compete. By 1980, the VHS format dominated 60% of the US market. I think my grandfather died in the video format wars. And that market was getting bigger and bigger. As more home video technologies were emerging and dropping in price, an enormous untapped revenue stream opened up for the Hollywood studios. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, more people began buying video cassette recorders, or VCRs. Not only could these devices play home movies recorded with consumer video cameras, but they could also record TV programs and play videotapes of feature films. Suddenly, people could watch Hollywood movies at home whenever they wanted. Kind of. At first, it was way too expensive for the average consumer to buy a video cassette of a Hollywood film. The studios charged between $80 and $90 per tape. What? But rental chains could buy them in bulk and rent them out to the general public for a few dollars a night, plus late fees. Those rental chains, places like Blockbuster Video or Hollywood Video, along with independent mom and pop stores, flourished throughout the 1980s and 90s. Film studios started going through their film libraries and releasing old movies on home video formats, as well as new ones, making money hand over fist. As this new home video market matured in the 1980s, a number of film companies decided they could bypass the theatrical distribution system altogether and market their films straight to the consumer. The most successful direct-to-video films fell into a few main categories: inexpensive action movies, steamy thrillers, sequels to successful theatrical films, and family films. Back in the 70s, as the first consumer home video formats were coming out, Laserdisc also emerged. Rather than recording images on magnetic tape, Laserdisc was an optical format which encodes binary data with a laser. It's a technology that eventually led to CDs, DVDs, and Blu-rays. Even though the picture quality was superior to either Beta or VHS, Laserdisc was ultimately doomed. The discs themselves were cumbersome and fragile, the players were expensive, and you couldn't record TV shows on them.
In all of cinematic history, there is no one more capable or famed for striking moviegoers with such powerful scores than John Williams. The next project Spielberg and Williams worked on together was Jaws. Williams says that when he first played the shark's theme for Spielberg, the director thought he was kidding and laughed. But Spielberg couldn't have been more far off. This theme is one of the most daunting and terrifying pieces of music created for the screen. Those two notes have become practically synonymous with sharks and are ingrained in our cultural conscience as the approach of danger. We hear the music start when we only see children playing in the water or a boat out on the ocean. However, due to the music, we know the shark is there. Not only did this use of leitmotif help build the suspense, but it was actually necessary to the production of the film. The robotic shark Steven Spielberg was using was constantly malfunctioning, forcing him to find creative ways to represent its presence. Additionally, if you look at the shark for too long, if you actually see its face and body, it is clearly fake. Therefore, it was a genius move to use the music to indicate that the shark was near.
When the former governor of Georgia decided to run for president in 1975, it was not as if America had been waiting for him with bated breath.
Jimmy who? Jimmy Carter. Jimmy who?
I don't know who he is.
He was so unknown that his surprise win in the Iowa caucuses brought headlines blaring the same question. Carter's campaign came down to one simple promise.
I'll never tell a lie. I'll never make a misleading statement.
After the lies of Watergate, it worked. Carter went on to defeat incumbent Gerald Ford, maybe not so much because of what he said, but because Ford had pardoned Richard Nixon. The low point for Carter came when Iran's revolutionary leaders took U.S. diplomats hostage. The conflict set off a fuel shortage back home, and Americans faced long lines at gas stations from coast to coast. A military mission to rescue the hostages collapsed in an Iranian desert, and with it, Carter's campaign for re-election.
This is one of my favorite opening scenes to a movie. It's from 1977's Saturday Night Fever. Tony Manero's walk, the Bee Gees in the background, the paint can, double-stacked pizza. This. I love this scene because there's this weird sense of glamour to everything. And that's actually pretty reflective of the moment in history this film tries to capture. A moment in the 70s that left a lasting impact on American sexuality, especially the American man, and prompted a backlash.
Disco was a very eclectic sort of music. It started out being a little bit of everything, and I think at its best it still remains very, very unpredictable.
And it was those at the margins of society who really defined the direction that disco would take.
The venues where disco flourished and first took root, and the communities that fed into that and that served as its dancers, as its music producers, as its DJs, and so on, came directly out of especially black and brown Latinx communities that we might describe now as queer.
Gay liberation in the 60s and 70s, and crucially the Stonewall riots in 1969, were very important for disco.
Up until the Stonewall riots, the survival strategy of queer communities was to be as invisible as possible, to not get noticed.
Despite the 1960s being characterized as a decade of free love, being gay was still illegal in most of the country. Even in New York City, gay bars didn't allow dancing between same-sex couples. Enter the Stonewall Inn, opened in 1967. Its clientele included drag queens who were often turned away from other gay bars, as well as runaways and homeless youth, and gay men weren't told that they couldn't dance together. In June 1969, Stonewall was raided by the police, and the people who went there fought back. The police were actually forced to take cover inside the bar, where the angry mob locked them in and set the building on fire. In the aftermath, the regulations that ruled New York City nightlife relaxed, including the ban on same-sex dancing. Gay nightlife in the city exploded, and everyone wanted to dance.
Most of the clubs that existed before Stonewall were really very underground, with one or two exceptions. And after that, there was a much more comfortable gathering of people. You were going to celebrate a kind of openness that really hadn't been possible before.
That's where the disco DJ comes in. Disco really gave birth to the modern DJ. These guys were innovating with technology and music in a way that hadn't been done before. And maybe for the first time, they had devoted followings that followed them from club to club.
The DJs that were playing what became known as disco were, I think, really adventurous. You could go to a club and hear music that you wouldn't hear anywhere else, and hear it put together in a way that you wouldn't hear in any other format.
Now, while disco was pretty much defined by gay men, club owners, prominent DJs, producers, record promoters, as it evolved as a genre, it was the voice of female artists, particularly women of color, who came to dominate the sound. In her book Hot Stuff, Alice Eccles discusses how female disco artists like LaBelle and others expanded the idea of what was socially acceptable for women by singing about female sexual desire. Part of the exception to the music was part of a bigger exception to the spread of disco culture and what it represented. Gay nightlife was becoming increasingly cool among celebrities and trendsetters. In a column in 1975, Aletti estimated that 2,000 discos had sprung up across the United States, with 200 or 300 in New York alone. And that was even before the symbol of disco debauchery Studio 54 opened its doors, and Saturday Night Fever broke box office records.
Gay clubs, I think, really changed the whole way people went out dancing. And they did represent a kind of freedom to the gay people that went there. And a lot of straight people enjoyed going there for the experience of sort of taking part in this liberation.
It's especially interesting to look at how disco transformed, or at least tried to transform, what it meant to be a man in the 1970s. The sense that you should be wearing clothes that were much more fitted to the body, much more revealing of the body, that you should be in shape. And it also assumed that you should know how to dance.
Sylvester Stallone had the muscle, but some of the best moves in Rocky belong to a behind-the-scenes cinematic champ. The same guy who gave us chills with every hotel hallway turn in The Shining. And also made sure audiences had a forest chase to remember in Return of the Jedi.
It consists of 4 things that make it work.
Meet Garrett Brown, a one-time folk singer who revolutionized movies with the Steadicam. Before his creation, this is how Hollywood would get those smooth-moving shots, with cameras put on platforms called dollies or rolled on rails. Anything handheld would shake and bounce. Garrett Brown figured out a better way. In 1974, this was his solution. The camera stabilizing system, or Steadicam, where no matter how you would tilt the camera, the picture would always remain level. In the mid-1970s, Garrett made a Steadicam demo film of his girlfriend, now wife, running in Philadelphia. Producers took notice. So did the director of a low-budget boxing film.
If you had never used the steps for the Philadelphia Art Museum in your demo, chances are Rocky would never have used the steps or never run the steps.
Possibly, yeah, probably.
That most iconic scene might not be there.
Yeah.
With Rocky, offers started pouring in for Brown, like from Stanley Kubrick, who asked him to work on The Shining.
The maze, yeah. I actually shot almost all the moving shots in that film, all the stuff in the corridors, all the moving, and he had in his mind this eerie smoothness. And that we were able to deliver. That almost turned it into the hotel's point of view.
Next, Martin Scorsese wanted him to shoot Raging Bull.
I did the shot with De Niro coming down and into the ring and all that. That was great. As soon as I started shooting in the ring, Scorsese had his guy pull me over and said, "You're fired." I said,
"What?"
I said, "Why?" And he says, "It looks too much like a Rocky."
My film is not a movie. My film is not about Vietnam. It is Vietnam. It's what it was really like. It's crazy. And the way we made it was very much like the way the Americans were in Vietnam. We were in the jungle. There were too many of us. We had access to too much money. Too much equipment. And little by little we went insane.
A bigger division now when we talk about one of the most talked about films in years, Francis Coppola's Vietnam War film, Apocalypse Now. It's almost been 10 years in the making. One of the first Vietnam War films conceived. It's the story of a young Army captain, Martin Sheen, being sent up a river to Cambodia to kill a renegade Army colonel, Marlon Brando, who's been disobeying orders and has set up his own jungle kingdom. Farther up the river, Sheen encounters a warmongering Army colonel, Robert Duvall, who says he loves the smell of napalm. He says it smells like victory. Now, this is a very big film that tries to say a lot of conventional things about the war, about the arrogance of our war effort. That part of the film is very colorful, impressive, sometimes even memorable. But Apocalypse Now is also after a much bigger target, nothing less, I think, than a speculation on the nature and source of good and evil in the world, how the war came about. I think that America is so conflicted about the war. The people who served feel bad about it. The people who didn't serve feel bad about it. The people who didn't stop it. I think that you can show almost anything to do with Vietnam and people feel, oh my God, the human waste.
That may be true, but on the other hand, this movie is made on such an epic scale. The filmmaking is so good. The performances, particularly by Martin Sheen and Robert Duvall, are so good that we don't see stuff like this every day. This is an extraordinary event.
Heaven's Gate was considered to be the worst movie ever made when it released in 1980. It was almost 4 hours long and had this awful-looking sepia filter that made it almost impossible to see anything clearly. Pretty much every major critic ripped it to shreds after the premiere in 1980.
I was really shocked. I went to see it. I thought, gee, it can't be as bad as everybody said it was as bad as everybody said. Two great big no votes on Heaven's Gate.
The most infamous review came from the New York Times critic, Vincent Canby, who described the experience as a forced 4-hour walking tour of Winona's living room. Definitely not the kind of movie you'd want to go see, especially when Empire Strikes Back had just come out a few months earlier. Heaven's Gate was directed by Michael Cimino, who up until this film was actually a pretty great director.
Cimino told UA he thought he could make it for the cost of an average movie, $7.5 million. Over the next 2 years, that number would mushroom by 500%, all with the approval of the executives at United Artists.
For the set of Heaven's Gate, he had an entire 19th century town built, with interiors and all. The period steam engine used in the movie had to be shipped all the way from Colorado across several U.S. states at the cost of $150,000. Along with the main cast, 2,500 extras were hired to fill the massive landscapes Cimino had constructed. The actors and actresses all had to participate in what they called Camp Cimino in order to achieve Cimino's obsessive quest for authenticity. One of the most egregious examples of Cimino's abuse of the budget was the construction of an irrigation system under the battlefield to assure the grass would be vividly green before it was turned to red by the blood of the ensuing carnage, which, by the way, you couldn't even see due to the sepia tone that draped over the whole film. After the disaster that was Heaven's Gate, studios would no longer allow directors the same creative freedoms they had in the 70s. The groundbreaking personal filmmaking of the era was at an end.
That ended a period of filmmaking in America, which is more personal, I think, and it's a problem now to get the pictures made. And now apparently
those personal filmmakers of the 70s struggled to stay relevant as the industry shifted its focus towards the broader appealing blockbuster films of the 80s. With a simple premise and a likable hero anyone could get behind, these types of films told indulgent stories of action, adventure, and romance. In just a few short years, the American cinema had become an escapist fantasy.
The horror genre of the 70s was one of the greatest in history. Classic killers like Michael Myers and Halloween terrified teenagers everywhere. The religious-themed Exorcist made Americans crawl out of their skin and gave us some of the most iconic horror movie images of all time. People's heads are still spinning about this movie today. Look at that! Look at that! Are you kidding me? The 70s brought the start of the gut-busting series Alien, where Sigourney Weaver saved the world from a bunch of aliens using humans as hosts. Okay, so this is the part where the alien comes bursting out of his chest. We can't show you that, but it's really gnarly. All of these movies did an amazing job of sparking the imagination of the American people.
Whether it be music, fashion, TV, or movies, culture in the 1970s was truly unforgettable. The nation had shifted to become more and more socially liberal, and as we know, every action creates an equal and opposite reaction. It's time for the conservative tide to wash across the nation.